Hey, welcome to 12 Tone, check this out. Sounds pretty cool, right? It's got a lot of motion and plenty of weird-looking chords that seem like they'd make it really hard to analyze. Now, what would you say if I told you that from a theoretical perspective, it's actually just two chords? It's basically just E-flat major to B-flat 7 and back again. So why does it sound like so much more? Well, let's step back for a second and talk about line cliches. We've looked at these before in a couple different song analyses, but I figured it was time they got their own video, so let's do this. Line cliches are a technique for creating a sense of harmonic motion without actually changing the harmony, at least not very much. They're a pretty simple idea. You take a chord like this E-flat major, then you pick one note in that chord and start to drift it up or down a half step at a time. For instance, if we picked B-flat, the 5th degree of the chord, it'd move up to B, C, D-flat, and so on, all while the other chord tones stayed the same. If we instead picked E-flat, the root, we'd take it down to D, D-flat, and C. We could also start on G, the 3rd degree of the chord, but since it's between the other two, it's hard to decide which direction it should go, and since the 3rd degree plays such an important role in defining how that chord sounds, we tend not to base line cliches off it. It loses too much of the chord's identity, which defeats the purpose. The most common line cliches, though, are usually based on minor chords, so if we take E-flat minor and do the same things, we get this and this. These again create a sort of mixed sensation where the harmony feels like it's moving forward, but it also feels like it's sitting still. As a brief side note, moving a half step at a time like this is called chromatic motion. That term will come up again later, but first, what are these actually useful for? Well, the big thing is to make chords last longer. Often the sense of motion in a piece of music is driven by changing chords, and line cliches give you a way to do that without actually changing the underlying harmony. You're cycling through a lot of different versions of the same chord instead of going to new ones. This means you can write whole long sections out of only a couple actual chords, like we talked about in the Hey Bulldog video, where the entire chorus is actually just B minor and E minor, but they still manage to create this long sense of rising tension thanks to line cliches. But there's another benefit to playing slowly, which we talked about a couple weeks ago in our 4-chord loops video. If you play each chord for long enough, you break down the harmonic structure of the piece and allow yourself the freedom to experiment more without being bound to something like a key center. Line cliches are like the ultimate slow playing technique. You can make a single chord last for like 10 seconds or even longer without feeling like you've stopped moving. One of my favorite ways to exploit this comes from one of the major line cliches we saw earlier. This pattern ends on a dominant 7th chord, and as we've discussed elsewhere, dominant 7th chords really want to resolve. They have a strong directional pull towards any chord whose root is a perfect 5th down, so we can take this E-flat 7 and resolve it to A-flat major, at which point we can turn around and start another line cliche, this time ending on A-flat 7, which again wants to resolve, this time to D-flat, where we can start another line cliche, and we can continue through this cycle indefinitely, moving through every possible key without ever really feeling lost. But let's go back to that thing from the beginning. This is called an omnibus progression, and it's the same basic idea, except this time we have two lines moving away from each other. We can ignore the E-flat chords at the beginning and end, they're not important right now. What we're interested in is the 5 chords in the middle, starting with the B-flat 7. The notes are arranged such that D is the lowest, then F, A-flat, and finally B-flat on top. Those two middle notes are going to stay perfectly still. Every single one of these chords has an F and an A-flat in it. Meanwhile, the D in the bass and the B-flat on top are going to switch places. The D walks down to a low B-flat, while the B-flat goes up to a high D. If we just follow those two lines, we get this, which almost looks like the notes are running away from each other. Once they swap places, we have our B-flat 7 again, and since it still wants to resolve to E-flat, we can break the chromatic motion and go back to our 1 chord, making this just an elaborately decorated dominant resolution. But we don't have to stop there. We can keep going as long as we want, even going through the entire octave and ending back where we started. You may notice, though, that this ending feels less like a resolution than it did before. I have a couple theories on that point. The first is simply a matter of voicings. Our moving lines have gotten so far away from the inner voices that the entire thing starts to feel somewhat hollow, weakening the overall harmonic cohesion. My second theory is that we've just been sitting in this complex chromatic weirdness for longer, so our ears aren't expecting a sudden return to standard functional harmony. I'm not really sure which of those factors is to blame, although I suspect it's a mix of both. To avoid this extreme stretching, though, we can also spread the rising line out between our voices. The bass should still do the entire descending part, or it loses that omnibus feel, but we could, say, do something like this, where there's always one voice moving up, but we switch around which one it is in order to create a more coherent harmony, and when we get to the end, we still have a pretty strong resolution. It's not quite as striking as the version where one line does the whole thing, but it's not as confusing either, so That's nice. Plus, this one has a bunch of dominant 7th chords along the way, and you can stop at any of them you want, giving you a nice handy tool for smoothly switching keys. Anyway, that's basically it, but before we go, I did want to mention that the academic talk I did a while back is online now. Actually, it's been online for a while now, but I forgot to mention it in a video. I made it unlisted because I wasn't sure how many people would care, but there's a link in the description if you want to check it out. So yeah, thanks for watching, and thanks to our Patreon patrons for supporting us and making these videos possible. If you want to help out and get some sweet perks like sneak peeks of upcoming episodes, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.